Here we have a man who needs no introduction. But nevertheless, it's my pleasure to introduce him. We're very happy to have Terrell Jermaine Starr here. He's an independent journalist, widely known for his coverage of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. He's the founder of the newly formed Black Diplomats Media Network that includes Black Diplomats newsletter on Substack, Black Diplomats Official YouTube channel, and Black Diplomats podcast. Terrell's work centers the Black perspective in foreign policy and doesn't shy away from inserting his personal views into reporting when he talks about Ukraine, Gaza, or any other part of the world. A former Fulbright grantee, he is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Independent Policy. He is also a returned Peace Corps volunteer, having served in Georgia in 2003 to 5. He has master's degrees in journalism and Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies from the University of Illinois, as well as a bachelor's degree from Philander Smith College, a historically Black college in Little Rock, Arkansas. Terrell is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and divides his time between New York City and Ukraine. Thank you again, Terrell, and welcome to Chicago.
Well, thank you all very much for me here. And this is my fourth school in about 7 days. So I've literally been everywhere talking about Ukraine in my coverage, and most importantly, why we all ought to be invested in learning more about Ukraine and caring about Ukraine. And this talk is really about my message of how I use my journalism to convince us all that we need to be invested in each other's safety and security. That's really the genesis of my work. And so while I devote a lot of time talking about Ukraine, my main aim is for us to develop a dialogue about how we communicate with each other and how we engage the world. Ukraine just happens to be a special place where that foundation is set, where I've developed my expertise. But the story about Ukraine is really one about all of our safety and security and creating a space where we all can feel comfortable talking about that. And so before I really get into my talk, which is about the 2024 presidential campaign and Ukraine's importance in that, I really think it's important for me to talk about what foreign policy is and how I view it. So foreign policy really is really about how we want the world to exist and how we all should live inside of it. That's really what it is. And foreign policy has been a conversation whereby led by these ivory tower types government. So it's a really top-down conversation. And so it's a subject which we are rarely ever fully engaged. And most people don't feel safe or feel comfortable asking questions. That whole saying is, I'm not afraid. They fear asking a dumb question, which is ironic because the people who are in charge of our foreign policy make dumb decisions all the time, right? Yet we, the ones who are most impacted by it, are afraid of asking dumb questions. Yet we're led by, in many instances, very dumb people, including those who run for president of the United States. And so my journalism, particularly as an independent journalist, it has really given me the freedom to really reimagine the role of journalism within the digital age and really make people feel participatory in these conversations. So I don't think that there's a better analogy to really talk about foreign policy than the city of Chicago. And by the way, I was born and raised in the city of Detroit, two Midwestern cities. And, you know, every part of this city was planned and mapped out. So when you think about the University of Chicago, you think about the parks, you think about the downtown area, it was all mapped out. And most importantly, we really need to think about who are the people who decide to map out this city. When you think about the projects here, the South Side of Chicago, you think about Cabrini Green, which is no longer here. And I think about Cabrini Green and I think about the projects because like many Black people in the United States of America, many of us who immigrated from the South to the North during the multiple great migrations, Black people were designated to be in very particular places. That story is not germane to Chicago, it's germane to the rest of the country. My point is that is all urban planning. Foreign policy is a global version of urban planning. We have, when this is not the subject of the talk, but we have the whole conversation of Gaza going on in Israel. Israel, like many countries around the world, are carved up by a few people and a few select people in certain rooms and capitals across this world. And so if you look at it that way, you all get to say, maybe I have a say, and maybe I don't think that our government should make this decision or that decision. And so looking at it from the perspective of global urban planning, you all have an equal stake in how this world ought to be. When I talk about Ukraine right now in my work, this is a conversation about Ukraine's sovereignty, but it's a bigger question about how invested are we in Ukraine's security, because inevitably it really plays a role in ours. And I will explain that. Many of you all followed me when I was in Ukraine covering the war from its onset. And I'll take you to the very beginnings of that foundation and how I began reporting and what I learned from that and what I'm taking into this election. So when I was in Ukraine, I just left my job at the Root. And we all know in the digital age, people are losing their jobs, or the jobs are being downsized, or they are reimagined to the point where your role is no longer relevant in the way that you originally planned for it. And so my job at the Root was I was a traveling correspondent, and that job was reduced to social media posting. I no longer wanted to do that, so I quit. And so that was October of 2021. A month or so later, I went to Ukraine with all the money I had in my pocket. Did not think that I would be covering a war. My job, my plan was to start a tourism business, because I enjoyed living in Ukraine, and my objective was I wanted to get paid for going to a place that I genuinely love being in. So imagine, there are not a lot of people who love a country so much that they would do their COVID summer there. I did my COVID summer in the Carpathian Mountains in Ukraine. So that's why I went to Ukraine. Now, when it became clear that Russia invaded Ukraine, I decided that I would stay. But there are something that was really important that I noticed that a lot of people in government via reporting got wrong. The intelligence suggested that Ukraine would fall in a matter of days, the capital within a week. I never believed that would happen. Here's why. The traditional intelligence gathering, it focuses on how many artillery pieces are available, how many fighter jets, how many tanks, how many soldiers. And particularly, a lot of people were thinking about Ukraine in 2014 and how they defended themselves against the first invasion that took place at that time. I'll tell you what I was paying attention to that made me feel comfortable in staying. There was a seething disgust, anger in Ukraine that was featured on daily TV news. What did I see? I saw old men, 70, 80 years old, speaking with local reporters in Kharkiv and Kherson and Zaporizhia, who were saying that I'm not going to be a slave. And in Russian, the word in Russian about slavery is called rabstvo, slavery. We're not going to be their slaves. We're not going to cede anything to them. If we don't have guns, we'll throw rocks. And I was traveling around with a guy named Malcolm Nance, and he colorfully described the Ukrainian resistance as the white Taliban. And I think that means something, because so much of a country's defense has to do with your willingness to fight. And I think that in all of the highbrow analysis, that on-the-ground cultural nuance and understanding was severely underestimated and undervalued, not only by Western sources, but also the Kremlin. So the Kremlin also got bad intelligence in that regard, because and again, all of this has been widely reported by reputable news networks, but I didn't need that reporting to convince me of what I was already witnessing on the ground. And so I made me feel confident in staying. And also the number of men who are rushing to sites to get their automatic rifles that were provided by the government. And so that was one of my first stories, which was going around with my friend Andre, who was going from site to site because the sites literally ran out of weapons to give to people. So there are men rushing to fight. And so once my friend Andre got his weapon, I used this camera. You all saw me on CNN, MSNBC, and everywhere with the camera from this phone. Everything I did came from this phone. Everything. And you would be amazed that I did not lose one internet connection. The Wi-Fi, even during the Russian invasion, they did not touch the comms, amazingly. And so it was uninterrupted 24 hours. All right. So as I was, and so I never covered the war before. And I was learning what to do on the spot. So I actually was deciding, okay, what type of story am I going to cover? So I told you about Andre going to get the guns. I would go to a checkpoint, and there was always a story there. So I would say I'm reporting from this checkpoint wherever I was, and I was just describing what was going on. But you would just be amazed at how much people were really enthralled and was just drawn into that, because it was giving people on the ground coverage as they themselves would cover it, because most people don't have large fancy camcorders or video recorders. They have a phone just like me. So it was kind of like a voyeuristic experience that I was taking people through. And and so I realized that was a technique that would be very germane to my capabilities. And so I just maximized my skill set in order to tell those stories as best I could. But at the same time, I was gathering my human intelligence, so to speak. And so what does that mean? I was talking to the soldiers I was with for the first 2 weeks. They were not professionals, they were volunteers. And so they were museum curators, they were agricultural specialists. And many of you may know that a lot of the people who were critical in saving Kyiv were not trained soldiers. So that's an important thing to note. But all of this, but people saw what happened after the fact. I saw the organization of all these men and women, because the increase in women went up in the Ukrainian armed forces. I forgot by what percent it's incredibly high. I don't want to give you a wrong number, but I knew that I was on to something in regards to how miscalculated the Ukrainian military was in their willingness to fight. So my job switched from covering military issues, because our location, where we were positioned, was bombed by a Russian fighter jet. And so 4 people died from that experience. And so, and also the day before, some suspected saboteurs were trying to go through our checkpoint, and they were in the soldiers I was with killed those soldiers. And so it was, so at the same time I was witnessing death for the first time, and just extreme violence. And there's no school that can actually train you to do that at all. You just have to do the best you can and do it with the best integrity that you have. But at any rate, I was on CNN every single day covering these stories, literally every day. And it was almost if I was waking up to go to work, even though they weren't paying me anything, which is another conversation. So I was on CNN every single day. Now, I continue to take people, I help people to flee the war. And a lot of Black people began to follow me on social media with a lot of intrigue. And the going joke within these circles was I was conducting the Underground Railroad in Ukraine for Ukrainians, because it was this Black guy helping these kind of quote unquote white people go into the European Union. And so that was just a thing of wonder for them. But the reason why they cared was because I cared. And that really deals with the importance of, one, having diversity in storytelling, and that the ways, and also I'm somebody, because of my training and the pedagogy that I've undergone as a Reese graduate, I can talk about parallels of oppression. So, and I could talk about hegemonies, which are, these big fancy words that we learn in graduate school, right? I definitely, as Black Americans, we come from a tradition where Western hegemony and Western imperialism has impacted people of color across the world. But as a Reese graduate, I could tell you that Western hegemony is not the only one that exists. And so my skill set of being a Black person who grew up in a Black city, went to a Black school, and, and come from all these backgrounds, and who's gone to Ukraine, who's gone to Georgia and has actually lived there. I'm somebody who's lived in all of these worlds. And I know how to get all these people who otherwise would not communicate with each other in the same space together. And so that was my goal. And what made me different from the people at CNN and ABC is that I did not have to negotiate this kind of BS line of objectivity, which I never promised to be. I don't believe, I like to say that I don't think that it's journalism when you try to balance, when you try to put on a scale 30 pounds of silver with 100 pounds of shit. Sometimes there is no balance. Sometimes one side is right, the other side is completely wrong, right? But had I worked at these larger networks, I wouldn't be able to have this ability to tell the stories in which I've told them. Now, 2 years in, right, we had a foreign policy election. This year is as big a foreign policy election as it's ever been. We have Gaza and the ways in which a lot of Arab Americans are really angry and outraged, rightfully so, with how Biden is handling the situation with Benjamin Netanyahu. We have China, right, in the South China Sea. We have expansionism there. We have the situation with the Uyghurs too, which our State Department and Antony Blinken has talked about as genocide, which I find interesting is that he finds a genocide case there, but not in Gaza. That's a whole different story. But also, even one that is not officially determined, but one that I use my own editorial purposes, I do believe that what Putin is doing in Ukraine is a genocide. And so I've stated there and I've made that clear, and I could talk to you all about that in the Q&A. But we're in a really interesting right now where you have two very drastically different people, where you have Joe Biden, who is who he is, but you also have Trump, who is a white nationalist, who said that he's a nationalist, but he forgot the word white, because essentially that's what it is. And what we noticed with Ukraine, where the aid that was ongoing with Ukraine, it ended up stopping with Speaker McCarthy. And you know what really was the shift? It was the Freedom Caucus with Matt Gaetz, who used a really kind of funny rule, like a real peculiar rule that allowed him to challenge the speaker's power. And that went on with a power struggle for a few weeks. And then there was a new speaker in Mike Johnson. And Mike Johnson is taking on the MAGA crowd and the MAGA contingency, where they have taken issues like the border, and one of the main cities that's being impacted by this issue is Chicago, right? And so you have a situation where migrants are being bused into cities like Chicago, New York, where I'm from, and in Los Angeles and other large cities. And what's interesting is that a lot of these this MAGA busing policy that's being run by Governor Abbott are being directed at cities that are run by Black mayors. That's really important to distinguish. Another important thing to mark is that a lot of these cities received a significant number of Ukrainian refugees. And so why does all this make sense? So even in a city like Chicago, I know because I'm working on a story on this very subject, and that basically what you have is you have a situation where locals feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. They feel like, okay, so much money is going to these immigrants. I think that's a really it's used pejoratively, so I'm just quoting. It's going to these immigrants, it's going to these Ukrainians, and you even have some people within the Black communities who are saying, what about us? This is all deliberate. It's all completely deliberate. It's a divide and conquer, right? And so now here's the biggest irony here. For a long time, we didn't have many examples of anti-Blackness and white supremacy hurting other people other than people of color. What's happening with Ukraine is interesting, is that this MAGA contingency, which is operating on America first, that includes Ukraine. Why are we sending money to Ukraine when we need to take care of our own safety, when in fact, the whole border situation is hyper exaggerated and is turned into this very exaggerated discourse about crime and safety, which coalesces around this MAGA sentiment of white grievance and siege mentality. And so you have these really serious conversations that require some nuance. And so as opposed to focusing on Ukraine's security, they're using racism to jeopardize Ukraine's sovereignty. And so the Senate passed a bill that was worth $90+ million. The lion's share of it is supposed to go to Ukraine, but Donald Trump has decided that this is not something that we ought to run on. We need more money for our border. The reality is that this is not about border security. This is not about taking a holistic approach to safety for America and also safety for the people who definitely need refuge. It's not about that. This is about feeding angrily into white fear. And so the very anti-whiteness, the xenophobia that only impacted people of color is now impacting Ukraine. So my point is that if there is not a better example of how we all need to be invested in each other's safety and security, it ought to be this. I often had a lot of conversations, a lot of them uncomfortable. I tend to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations because I talk about race honestly. It is that whether it's Gaza, whether it's Ukraine, if we just say that it's those people's problems, their problems are going to eventually become our own. And so as a society, what do we do about this? Because if we don't engage society, if we don't engage foreign policy inevitably engages us. My work is really focused on, especially during this election cycle, we need to reframe the conversation about foreign policy in Ukraine and what does that mean for us? And the way that I am reframing it is talk about security and safety and what does that all mean? And that includes talking with Americans across this country, which is what I'm currently doing, about why should you care about Ukraine? What does that do for me personally? Because unfortunately, a lot of our lawmakers don't do a good job of talking about foreign policy and making it a kitchen table conversation, like we talk about healthcare, like we talk about the economy, and like we talk about everything else. When I was organizing and doing these talks, I was really thoughtful about how I would lead these conversations. And I thought about kind of leaning on this very esoteric kind of insidery conversations about Ukrainian politics, et cetera. But what I realized is that people really didn't want that. They wanted to know how they personally can be invested in the conversation. And the best way to do that is to talk about their safety. And when I have conversations with Ukrainians, there's a one guy in particular I talk to every couple of weeks when I'm in Ukraine, and we just share notes. I'd say, this is what's going on in the States. And he says, okay, this is what's going on in Ukraine. And, we're really frank with each other. This guy's a, government official, whatever. And I say, and he says, Terrell, what's going on with Trump? Why is he doing this? Right? Because he speaks candidly with me. And I said, racism. Racism is really, U.S. racism has a lot to do with this holdup with your aid in Ukraine. And I have to tell you that in my experience, most officials that I meet and I talk with in Eastern Europe who come to United States, get their degrees from University of Chicago or from Columbia or from UCLA or wherever, they rarely go into the Black communities. They rarely go into non-white places. I'm usually not only the first person that they have a substantive conversation with, I'm usually always the first person to have a conversation with them about race in America. If you don't understand race in America, you don't understand America. And if you don't understand race in America, you're not going to understand the problems behind the aid in Ukraine. If you're not making these intersections in your classes, you're missing something and you're doing your students a disservice. And above all, you're doing the country a disservice. And so we also live in a country that actively prevents race from even being a subject of conversation, with book bans, attacks on critical race theory and DEI. And so I was just at Harvard last week and Yale, two epicenters where this subject is taking place. And we think about it as a domestic issue, but inevitably it harms our foreign policy. Because the people who do understand race really well in America and use it towards their aim is Moscow. They understand it perfectly well. They understand it well in their engagement on the continent of Africa and the global South. And so if we do not make these intersections from a policy standpoint, we have to realize that our adversaries, if you want to define it, what our adversaries do. My job is to connect all these dots and facilitate a conversation so that we can all figure out, regardless of what our political leanings are, how we can be in the same room where the Palestinian, the Israeli, the Ukrainian, the American, and the Uyghur, and everyone feel like they can be safe. Part of that means that we have to break away from colonialism or imperialism. That means that Americans need to have a stronger critique on the ways in which our institutions have impacted the rest of the world and reconcile for them. When I talk to Ukrainians, that means that while Russia is definitely engaging in a genocide against the Ukrainian people, we need to have an honest conversation about the ways in which African refugees were treated when they were fleeing the war. So when you go to the global South or when you go to the continent of Africa and ask them to join in your fight against Russian imperialism, and their whole thing is, what about how our people were treated? And you have nothing to say other than saying that what they saw was Russian propaganda and they know that's not true. Then what type of, then how invested are you in their safety, right? And so I think that the power of my journalism gives me the freedom to say all these things, because I think the downside of objectivity, at least for me, is that My role is that it doesn't add context. It doesn't do the important work of filling in the blanks that so much mainstream news doesn't do. And so that is my role with you, to fill in the context, to fill in the blanks, and more importantly, to bring in the humanity. And so that is the signature of my work. And I'm happy that you're all listening to me to talk about what that all means for you. So I'll end right here, and I'm looking forward to answering all your questions.
Thank you. That was great. We're going to take questions from the audience, and we are also taking questions on Zoom for those online if they want to pipe in. I have a few myself, but we'll go ahead and throw it over to you. No. I want to hear. Yeah.
So I absolutely agree that Trump is racist. I actually believe that his behavior has nothing to do with it. He wants to win election and make Biden look bad. How he can do it? Open borders, lost Ukraine on his watch, and also against his racism. Ukrainians are white. Why he cut their, if he really racist, like you're saying, like got racist, right? Why he gonna cut help to white people in Ukraine? It's against his racist views. He tried to cut help to Ukraine. Ukrainian are white people. Why racist would punish white people?
Oh,
I mean,
okay. That's a good question. Thank you.
So my point is that being racist, he also some kind of have agenda and strategy, and his strategy major to knock out Biden. All his racism, he could be not racist in some moves that will be bad for Biden. And so this is why I believe that his main quality in this potential election is his strategy to to win election from Biden, but not his racism. In this particular, while he is a racist, absolutely.
Okay, so it's interesting. So basically, the way that Trump talks about Chicago is something that started back in 2016. So that has always been his main talking point. He uses other cities, but Chicago in particular, what he does is that he takes these undocumented people, and this is via Abbott, buses them here, and then it's just another excuse for him to talk about crime. It's a very simple talking point. And so he does not, and also when you talk about the border, Democrats have had a number of conversations about ways in which they could negotiate with Trump on the, now I keep saying Trump, but I mean Mike Johnson in the House, right? I just say Trump by default because he manages everything, right? So there are conversations about the border that had not even been introduced to the floor. So that is my argument there. When you talk about Ukrainians, I'll give, about the racism. Here's the thing. It's not about, it has very little to do with Ukraine. It has more to do with America first. It's not about the Ukrainian white people. It's about these white people. And so you're taking money and resources from them. The biggest irony of that is that in his whole conversation about America first, much of that aid when it comes to manufacturing the artillery rounds that are going to Ukraine are made in America. And so it doesn't make sense from a technical level because the lion's share of that money is here in the United States. And so it's really simple. Why take it over there when it belongs over here? The racism part comes in where he has spent all of his time talking about Black people, talking about the ways in which he will restore safety to the American public. It's 90% going towards the border. And so you also have to think about the ways that the multiple comments that he has made about immigrants, that he has made about people who come south of the border. It's just a whole bunch of them. And I do not have in my mind or written down the things that he has said, but I just think that he has said it so often that it should be, it should be clear, but I'm sorry if it's not. But that has been the primary call of the MAGA version of the GOP. And so that's why I'm saying that it's fueled by racism, if that makes any sense to you. Yeah.
We have a question on Zoom.
It has to be that transmitter, yeah.
Okay, so Betsy asks, what specifically should we be calling on our elected representatives, including senators, to do for Ukraine?
Hey, so the problem is not with the Senate. The issue is with the House. So the Senate has already passed a bill. And I give you some background to really explain this. So what made support for Ukraine tricky is what's going on in Gaza. And so there are two things that that have really come up with Ukraine aid in the past few months that was not present when the war first started 2 years ago: the border and Gaza. We didn't have those two issues to complicate it. And what do I mean by complicate? The United States, regardless of party, has always had this stance of we will support Israel. What does that mean? That means that we support the state of Israel, which, of course, we should support a state's right to exist. The problem in this particular instance is that the problem right now is that you have what many people would consider, and I would consider, an overreaction to the October 7th attacks. And so what you're seeing right now is that that's a campaign strategy. And so for a large part of the American public, if you do not show 100% support for the state of Israel and their current actions, then there is a fear of losing political support. That's an important thing to consider. With the border, you have a very well-oiled comms machine that is saying that the more, that our borders are porous, and that the more people who are coming in, the more danger that we're going to be in. Now, here's the thing. There are legitimate conversations to be had about border security that don't have to lean on xenophobia and hatred of people who are brown. And so this was not a talking point several years ago because they weren't entering into a presidential campaign year. And so I don't think the issue is with the Senate. The problem is with the House. The problem is technical, and that one of the reasons why McCarthy was able to leave is that you just have one person who would challenge the speaker's authority, and then they can throw the leadership into a whole drama whereby you don't know who's going to be taking the speaker's seat. And so what can we do? One of the things that we can do, you can continue to write your congressperson. If you are I would go online, look at their votes. You go to house.gov, look at the people who vote for support for Ukraine and those who don't. If your congressperson does not vote for support for Ukraine, or if you look at media, just Google your House Speaker, not your House Speaker, your representative, and type in Ukraine. If they do not speak in support of Ukraine, call them. Now, I was an intern for a congressional, for a congressman, and people here write to your congressman and they don't think it helps. It really does. It's important. And people expect you to not be engaged. And so from an advocacy standpoint or from a lobbying standpoint, you'll be amazed at how much power and influence is swayed by people who are being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars per year and more. Just a small group of DC lobbyists that influence a lion's share of the policy. And so they're expecting the average American citizen to be asleep at the wheel. So by writing your congressperson showing up to their office, whether it's in the city or in Washington, makes a world of difference.
Hello. I was wondering if you could speak to, I'm just noticing, like, so my family's Czech, and the Czech people who live like like the one thing, like my mom's always raised me, like she hates Russia, obviously for like their history. And so one thing I've been noticing, like especially like people who come from places where there was Russian imperialism, especially here in the United States, like they still support Trump. And I'm like very like this is anecdotally Czech family friends and stuff, and like it's understood that like Trump and Putin are like this kind of thing. So I just like, have you noticed that with like Ukrainian, like could you speak, like the one thing that they hate the most in the world is Russia, and yet they're supporting a candidate? Is it okay? Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good question. It's really simple. So there's a book that's called When the Irish Became White that sets a really great foundation for this. I strongly recommend that you read it. And, you know, two things can be true at once. Regionally, even before I get into this, one of the first questions that I'm asked, and this is at a very basic level, is, you know, when I talk about with the invasion in Ukraine, is I thought they were the same people, or I thought all white people get along. So a lot of Americans, when we talk about race is a global thing, right? And Russia has its own version of it. And so basically, when there's even a difference in how Slavic peoples from Eastern Europe have, you know, experienced whiteness or a lack of it when they travel into the West. A lot of Eastern Europeans go into Western Europe as domestic workers. They do construction. When the European Union was being expanded into the former Warsaw Pact countries and the former Soviet countries, there was a lot of xenophobic fervor in Western Europe about these Eastern European hordes coming into the rest of Western Europe to take their jobs, right? There was a whole lot of that. And even cases of discrimination from Eastern Europe, right? And so the thing about it is that a person can face oppression within their own regional context, but then integrate into whiteness here and become white, right? That's all it is. Yeah. So it's really simple here. So if you are a Ukrainian, if you are a Russian, if you are Czech, if you are Hungarian, you come to the United States, you're white. It's really simple. And so you can take on the same ignorance as an oppressor. And I remember having a conversation. I would say, you know, people ask me, Terrell, how is it like being Black in Ukraine? And this deals with the larger conversation about racism abroad. I tell people that you can't escape anti-Blackness. It's everywhere. And there are articles online about Black people saying, I'm going to move to Europe so I can escape American racism. My thing is, okay, good luck with that. You know, if you have to read James Baldwin's work to really be reminded of the fact that, you know, in his words, it was something to the effect of, I'm not their nigga, you know, and so I'm America's nigga, but I'm not their nigga, right? And I say all that to say that Black, you know, people have to make a decision about who they're going to be when they come into these newfound lands and they find opportunity and they find freedom. And, you know, fighting oppression is bigger than escaping it. It's about fighting that thing that's inside of you, that you know, at that critical point where you say, I can either be a better human being and be invested in everyone's safety and their care, or I can just do the easy thing and integrate into American whiteness and just be as ignorant as anyone else. Because hey, I fled my oppressor, you know, and they may not even see it as joining the oppressor, right? And so every 2 months or so, I deal with the Ukrainian who says the most racist, ignorant stuff to me ever. And I'm fortunate enough to be patient enough to talk through it with them. I was talking with a woman in Berlin, just a random conversation. We're at a Ukrainian restaurant. I was doing a story on some of the work that they were doing. And one of the members, well, she wasn't a member. It was a sister of one of the members I was interviewing, who was telling me that she went to the United States for 3 months and told me that she faced racism from Black people. And I'm looking at her like she was the nuttiest person on earth. To their credit, the other Ukrainians were horrified by her story because she wouldn't shut up talking, because she kept digging herself into a hole. And she said that, you know, the people who would not tip were Black people. The people who didn't do this to me, my worst customers are Black people. I said, okay. So let me tell you about my first day in Ukraine. My first day in Ukraine, I was turned down for housing by 8 different landlords because I was Black. This happened in 2008. And so I was stopped so many times by cops during my first year in Ukraine that I stopped counting at 30. Let's compare our stories with the Black people who didn't tip and mine. So where does that leave us? And so, you know, we really, so part of my work, in addition to reporting, I spend a lot of time educating and informing people. I don't know if her mind changed after I told her this story, but I have multiple examples of that. But ultimately, it's most Eastern Europeans who come to the United States, they escape oppression, and a lot of them, they integrate into the very whiteness and the very types of white supremacy that they claim to abhor. And it's a really tragic story about humanity, but it's a common one.
Questions from Zoom or the crowd? Okay, we'll give it.
So I'm getting all. Okay, so this is a question from Michael. He gives some background. He's of Ukrainian Jewish descent. His question is, we want to halt money to Israel because of the atrocities in Gaza, yet we want to give all this needed aid to Ukraine. How do we push this politically? Basically, how do we stop money to Israel because of the atrocities in Gaza, but keep the support going to Ukraine?
All right, so this is a good question. I've actually been to the West Bank. So I've been to the West Bank, and I plan on going back this year now that if the Israelis allow me in. You know, because I was hit by the Israeli social media campaign that was very fierce, extremely fierce. But here's the thing about the West Bank, and I think it's very important to talk about this in connection to Ukraine. So what's going on in the West Bank, what's going on in Gaza is apartheid. And that's what I saw. And I'm not going to unsee that. It's horrible. And when I was traveling through some of the main cities like Hebron, there's legal language about purified streets. And I forgot the name of it, what technically the name of it, but basically there are streets where Palestinians can neither walk nor drive. And so it was really peculiar to me that I, as a Black person, I can walk on these streets, but a Palestinian, or more specifically an Arab, could not. And I found it to be one of the most sickening experiences that I felt in my life, and it was really difficult to really sit there. And it's an experience that, if you have a heart, it'll break you. It's It's bad and it's horrific. And it really is. Even when I think about it, it's really disgusting how people can sit by and justify this type of behavior. It's horrific and disgusting, gross. As far as what we can do, you know, the way that I explain it in a constructive way, in a very honest way, in a constructive way, is, you know, when I was in Ukraine, I reported with that passion because I believed that it was the right thing to do. I saw violence. I told people that I'm not objective. I tell people that I'm honest, and I'll tell you what I see. I will tell you the truth. That's what I did in Ukraine. When I was touring Gaza and I returned and I was sharing my thoughts on social media, I did the same thing. I showed you what I saw and I told you the truth. A lot of people who followed me for my Ukraine coverage turned on me when I was talking about my experiences in the West Bank. And what was interesting, you know, this person identified himself as a Ukrainian Jewish person, right? You know, and a lot of the people who were taking me around on tours in the West Bank, they were progressive Jewish people. But a lot of the people who were revolting against me on social media, they were a lot of people who had Ukrainian signs in their bios. Now, I had one social media post of me standing on the street in Hebron. I think it got something like 1 million impressions. And it got something like 1,000+ comments, which is a lot, right? And much of it was a well-coordinated campaign by Israeli lobby groups that have people who are paid to monitor social media accounts of people who post anything about Israel or the West Bank or Palestine. And that would usually, and the reason, talking about, and this is important context to answer this question, getting people to respond has a lot to do with people not being worried about losing their jobs, not worried about losing their positions where they are. And I think that's unfortunate because there is a way that we can constructively challenge the apartheid policies of the state of Israel without venturing into anti-Semitism. And the biggest tragedy in all of this is that anti-Semitism is a legitimate issue and it has risen significantly in the past few years. It was not Palestinians who are in Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us. They're white people. So as far as what we can do, I look at what's happening right now in Michigan about the non-committed vote. I'll tell you my position on this. Just as I tell people it's not my place to tone police about how they ought to respond to the violence the genocidal violence that Russia is placing on them, it's not my place to tone police Palestinians about how they ought to respond with the pain and anger that they're experiencing. They are intelligent enough to know that Trump is going to be a worse alternative than Biden. But at the same time, when you see someone standing by and aiding and abetting in the genocidal nature, and by genocide, we all saw the case that South Africa brought forth with towards against the state of Israel. And I've actually reported on this. So as far as what we can do, I think it's really important that we be brave enough to be morally consistent. Moral consistency requires us to have the intellectual dexterity to say, you know what, I am not somebody who wants a war, but in order for Ukraine to exist, they do need arms to defend themselves. With, framing it as in the case of defense. In the case of Israel, we see that this is not, and also let me say another thing too, and this is going to be controversial, but again, it goes back to the question, if you are somebody, a Palestinian, and you've been dealing with the violence that you've been experiencing day in and day out, you know, you really have to have an understanding of what Palestinian people are experiencing and appreciate, you know, and appreciate their lives. I really think that in order for us to really understand, in order for us to really support Palestine and challenge our constituents and challenge our government officials to be morally consistent, sometimes that does require you to say that in order to, the thing you most value from me is my vote, and I'm going to withhold that from you. Who am I to tell? And now that's a lot of Arab Americans support. I am from Detroit, Michigan. There are a lot of Black people who feel the same way. But for those of us who are going to vote, I think it's important for me as a journalist, when I'm interviewing officials, to put their feet to the fire about it. It is the responsibility of all of us to say that the violence that you're perpetrating against the Palestinian people is a violence that can't be tolerated. It's one that we have to decide if we're okay with Palestinians being treated this way, then we must be okay for it happening to us and everyone else. That's an issue of moral consistency. It's one that requires bravery. And I understand that everyone is not able to do that. But I think what we're seeing right now is more people are starting to realize that challenging the state of Israel does not mean that you are anti-Semitic. And a lot of people are finding the courage to do that. And so for this person, in their own way, in your own job, learn how to resist. It may not be going to a protest, but it may simply be putting up a Palestinian flag on your social media, or another form of symbolism that shows solidarity. All those things matter. They all count towards voicing your distaste for the moral inconsistency for how our government treats Ukraine's safety versus that of the Palestinian people.
Thank you. Mr. Starr, I have two questions for you. So the first one is, I'll just speak for the American people. We seem to have a problem with distinguishing critique of a government or regime over critique of the people who live in a place, or their race or their religion. And I'm wondering, so my first question is, how might we do a better job of helping people make that distinction? My second question is, you brought up about genocide, and you're saying that what's happening in Ukraine is a genocide. I'm hoping you talk more about that. And I guess my question here is, much like fascism as a thing has been, it's gotten loose. We attach fascism to all kinds of things that may not necessarily be fascism. And so I'm wondering if this the same confusion around a genocide, like, so my thought was a genocide is where you exterminate, you corporally exterminate a people. Yeah. But is it enough that you simply destroy the culture of a people without the body?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So let me deal with your thank you. So let me deal with your first question. So distinguishing, making a critique of, particularly in the state of Israel, what you're talking about Israel, right? And this applies to the Ukraine question too. So here's the thing. For me, I didn't learn about anti-Semitism, honestly, until I went to graduate school. We have to remember that Jewish people don't make up a large portion, of this country. Let's just be, just purely by the statistics, it's like not a large group, large population. And when I was growing up in Detroit, this was not something that I was thinking about. And my point is that there are a lot of people who I know I'm one of those people that's included, who have said things that were anti-Semitic. And it was simply because I just wasn't aware of the language, and I just needed to be, I just didn't know. So And you all remember when LeBron James a few years ago was talking about making money, he was competing, like making Jewish money. So here's the thing, if we're really, and again, this goes down to really just having a heartfelt just conversation about how we grow from one another. Growing up, I can remember a lot of my interaction with Jewish people and making jokes about that. And so we were just kind of thinking, oh, we can kind of joke about that. But then when we get into this larger digital world where things could be, you know, reshared and repurposed, retweeted, reposted. And then I think the problem is that we approach a lot of people with bad faith intentionally. It doesn't mean that we can't grow from one another. I'm just saying that I'm really happy that as I've learned to be a better person, to talk to a wide range of people, regardless of their backgrounds, is that I've been extended faith in addition to my learning. And what's happening right now is that the ways in which our political structures have talked about Israel for a long time is connected to the Holocaust, right? And so Joe Biden, for example, he became a senator during the early 1970s. Keep in mind that Israel as a state, it occurred in 1948. Historically, even now, that's not a long time to be a state, right? And so it was connected to the Holocaust. The problem is that our mainstream media, mainstream punditry does not critique Israel. Anytime there's a critique of Israel, it's framed in a way from some people and some bad faith actors, particularly the ones who are attacking my social media, is that you're attacking Jews' right to exist, right? And one of the most dubious people who I think is front and center in all of this is the head of the ADL, and Jonathan Greenblatt. I think that he is the most dubious, dishonest person to have conversations about this subject. And when you lead with that assumption, and particularly, you know, he's always a person that's carted out when you're talking, you know, anytime someone allegedly or maybe says something anti-Semitic, you know, and we remember it with Whoopi Goldberg, we remember it with a number of other folks who I think her biggest crime was that she was talking too much and didn't know how to shut up, right? But at any rate, when you lead with the accusation of anti-Semitism, we don't learn from one another. And we don't treat Israel as a state as it should be. If you want to be treated as a state, then its actions need to be critiqued as a state. And so people were so afraid of even, you know, engage in the conversation because we don't know much about each other. A lot of us don't know much about Judaism. And unfortunately, the Israeli lobby in DC, and I know that's a controversial term, but every place has a lobby. Okay, governments have lobbies, right? And so Israel has been really good at their lobbying campaigns against, you know, with elected officials, Democrats and Republicans, and taking them on these AIPAC trips to Israel, and not really taking them into the West Bank and all the places that I've been and seeing all the oppression that takes place there. And so a serious critique about Israel is difficult to start because people associate Israel with Jew. And if you associate Israel with Jew, then should we be surprised that sometimes in an act of ignorance and don't know better, people are going to conflate the two and say something anti-Semitic when they don't want to, because the whole campaign is, if you are, you know, Israel equals Jew. So if you want to talk about Israel, if Israel equals Jew, then y'all are genociders, right? And all these other things. And so that's the problem. And so until we are, you know, until we form groups, united groups with people who are intellectually dishonest and say, yes, I am Jewish, this is, you know, and I've been a part of these conversations, who separate Jewish people as people versus their state, then you're going to always be confused. Genocide, it's really simple. it's really, you know, the conversation around genocide is difficult to discuss because, one, most acts of genocide is a legal term and it's determined by the courts, right? And so it is, and it's a very high bar. It's, I don't know if illegal, you know, this is just me talking, right? And I'll talk through it and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially it's a really high bar. It's kind of similar to a hate crime, right? Hate crimes in the United States. One of the things that Eric Holder was talking about was that he could not, it was difficult to prosecute officers on hate crimes because the bar is so incredibly high. And, you know, normally cases like, you know, of hate crimes, they take years to prosecute. Same thing with genocide. A genocide can take anywhere from 10 years, 20 years to determine that it was a genocide. One of the ways that reason why I say Ukraine is a genocide, and this is different from destroying a culture versus destroying a people. A lot of that equals displacement of people. So there are tens of thousands, estimates go up to 6 figures of Ukrainian children that are kidnapped outside in Ukraine going into Russia. And I know a number of groups who document this, and the estimates are in the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian kids who are just literally being kidnapped and replaced. This is documented. And I know people who actually go into Russia to retrieve these children. That's one. Number two, the destruction of language. The Crimean Tatar language is completely, you know, in Crimea, the Russian authorities essentially have wiped it out. And that's another thing. Another issue with genocide is that you have to listen to what the Russian president says about Ukraine and also what officials like Dmitry Medvedev say about Ukraine. If you remember the case, recall from the case of the South African case of genocide against Israel, one of the things that the South African lawyers did a really great job of was play all the statements that Benjamin Netanyahu and his very far-right, racist, Islamophobic cabinet has said about Palestinians, and that equals intent. If you look at the ways in which Russian officials talk about Ukrainians, it's the same stuff. They make it clear. Putin has said clearly, Ukraine as a state does not exist. And so culture and destruction of a people, and you can make the argument that it's really intertwined. But the reason why people are really hung up about it is because it's something that's defined by the courts. But I put it to you this way, and we're not really engaged enough on the conversation of genocide. That's another thing. But everything about the UN statutes about genocide, everything that I described to you, particularly with the kidnapping of children, with the issues of language, the destruction of Ukrainian cultural sites, the destruction of the indiscriminate bombing of cities, ties into that. And if you look at the charges of, you know, with South Africa, there is a Ukrainian example of that. And so I think, you know, in closing, I'll say that part of the conversation around genocide is that if you say that a country is genocidal, then you have to act. So if the United States were to say that Israel or even Russia were committing acts of genocide, then there would have to be a political response to that. And so it's not just legal, it's political. And it's one of those charges where the politics and the legal intertwine, and one is usually followed by the other. That's a short version of a larger conversation, but I hope that helped.
Yeah,
Very small note
Is it on
about,
this?
yeah, genocide. So example of genocide is Holocaust. When people of one DNA, it's a gene, genocide, it's from a gene, destroy people of another genes, Jews. In fact, Ukrainian and Russian have 30 million families together. And in fact, the only principle that Russia did, it bombed territory of Ukraine. Whoever will be there will be killed. But in fact, it's not genocide. It's because they can say that they can bomb Russia the same way and have genocide against themselves because it's the same people. The only territorial people, the same nationality, or very close nationality. And some of them have joint mother Russian, father Ukrainian. It's like millions of Ukrainians, half Russians. You cannot have genocide against yourself. If you kill the person, no, it's different. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. But thank you. No, anyway, I'll be short because I know maybe something on Zoom. But no, but thank you for the question. So here's the thing. I think we can all say that the conversation of genocide, and I'm not saying this loosely. There are a number of well-respected human rights groups and legal groups in Ukraine that have said that this, what's happening is a genocide in Ukraine. The disagreement, I don't think it stems from the definition. It's more about, I think that there's a lack, there's just a lack of enforcement. There's a lot of behavior. There's a lot of behavior in this world that is genocidal. There's just a lack of political bravery to call it for what it is. And two, I think that there are a lot of Ukrainians who would say that we're not, that we have nothing in common with Russia as a nationality whatsoever. And I live there, and people tell me this every single day while I'm there. But I do believe that this conversation about what is genocide and what isn't is something that we as a people, it comes down to we have to use our common sense. And in addition to the law, one genocide expert that I spoke to from Rosem said that it's really, it's a Ukrainian a nonprofit organization that does humanitarian aid. And essentially what they said was that, it's up for us to make a call for, to determine what does it mean to destroy a people. It's up for us to challenge and hold our political entities accountable for that. Because regardless of how we view or understand the term genocide, if what's really clear from what I hear from Russian officials, every day you can hear someone, whether it's on social media, whether it's on state television, who say that Ukrainians should not exist. And many of these people are in parliament. Many of these people are close to the Kremlin, and you can hear it from Putin himself. And so I'll just end it there.
I'll ask a question now, just on a kind of different angle. That's the point. That's why we have these events. So I was really struck by something you said at the beginning about the media environment, that people who hadn't spent a lot of time in Ukraine just thought it would all fall, right? And just counted the number of tanks and counted the number of airplanes and assumed that Ukraine was dead. But you said that as someone who'd been on the ground, that knowing that local texture was really important. And then you also talked about the media texture in America. The media climate, and the fact that you had been a victim of this very rapidly shifting, degenerating media environment. So I guess I'm thinking about what you learned from those two scenarios. So in Russia, I was really struck when I lived in Ukraine that there were basically no reporters in Kiev from legacy media, right? They're all reporting from Moscow, and none of them even speak Ukrainian. So they all speak Russian. So that's a result of cultural imperialism. But America's media problems seemingly are a result of these capitalist conglomerates. So I guess I'm thinking about the two media environments in dialogue with each other, and to what extent you think that these media deserts that are forming or imploding media outlets, how you think that's going to affect the election? And then also, is there anything we can do about it?
Yes. So to answer your question about these imploding media environments, I always go back to the basics. To be a journalist is not like being a doctor or a lawyer or a veterinarian. These people require licenses, right? They need to pass the bar. They need to go to some type of school in order to be certified. What empowers us to be journalists is the First Amendment. It's the Constitution. And there is no certification process to be a journalist. Really, the beginning of journalism was predicated on where you worked. So if you worked at the New York Sun or the Washington Post or wherever, that determined you to be a journalist in the analog world, right? Your speech empowers you to talk. What I do and what a lot of people do, you just happen to call it journalism. But at the end of the day, we're empowered by the First Amendment. If you're suing a journalist or a newspaper or a network, these people are defended by First Amendment lawyers, because that's what it comes down to. So in the analog world, another thing that was really vital is that there weren't a lot of engines or dissemination or disseminators of news. You had ABC, NBC, CBS, eventually you had CNN, and then you had Fox News, right? And then you had your local newspapers. The advent of social media has created opportunities for all of us to spread news, whether we are journalists or not, right? And it's also redefined the ways in which we tell stories. And so the culture of storytelling and the culture of news is shifting drastically because people want to be informed differently. And social media has made us engage people that we trust. And that's the whole thing. Like, it's really about, do I trust you? And if I trust you as a source of information. And I may call you a journalist. I may call you a pundit, right? How that impacted, but I think that there's an issue with the coverage in that, a lot of folks, I call traditional journalism the white man's diary. And because I say this as somebody who graduated with a master's degree from University of Illinois up down the road. So, I've also, my first job was at an NPR affiliate in Champaign-Urbana. So I've gone through the traditional news outlets. So this is not me just hammering on traditional media. I was trained in traditional media. The issue is that we are really in a phase where media, our engagement is changing before our eyes. The root was under the Gawker network, and until Hakohen sued us to high heaven, right? Which is another story. But the way that Gawker told news was, people will tell you, I think you guys do great news, but you're assholes, right? Really, because Gawker was, I'm in your face, I'm just gonna come badass and punched up and punched down and just didn't care, right? That type, but it was hard-hitting journalism. Vice, very same way. You got guys going to Africa and getting high on mushrooms, wherever the hell, right? And this digital media culture has empowered people to take journalism into its own. And it's also democratized the way that people consume news and tell it. And I think that if we weren't living in the digital space, my type of storytelling wouldn't be possible. I don't. So social media became an unintentional disseminator and organ of news. It's also highly unregulated, where a lot of disinformation and misinformation was able to spread in ways that it didn't in the analog world. Now, that doesn't mean that that disinformation was absent from it. In fact, a lot of the race riots that took place in this country, you have the 1906 riots in Atlanta. They go on and on. Here in Chicago, they were run by disinformation, run by newspapers. In the analog world, crime is heavily reported and broadcast, even though in these very communities, the crime rates are going down. So my whole point is that disinformation and misinformation is not specific to the digital world. But it's also created a really great space for us to talk and communicate with one another in ways that we understand. And I think that makes journalism better. I think that's evolved. I think there are a lot of people who don't like it. What it means for me is that it empowers me to be independent, to develop my own base where I can finance my own work. That's why I filed work for a Black Diplomats Media Group to be a nonprofit newsroom and creating a new source of revenue and a business model, because we know that the current media cycle, you had the LA Times that dropped several hundred journalists, Vice dropped several hundred journalists recently. And that the issue is that journalism is one of the few professions where you're asked to produce a new product every day for free. A new car model is made every year. A clothing line comes out every fall or every spring. Journalism is a model that produces something every year. And the traditional model of making money has become more unsustainable in the digital age, and we're all figuring out in our personalities how to do it. There are a lot of journalists who can't do what I do because they don't have they're not trained on the business side of it, right? And I'm just learning the business side of it. I've literally spent all of my money to do all the reporting that I've done from Ukraine. And every day I'm trying to hustle to get more and more, and and I'm at the point where I'm doing what the big people do at CBC and ABC, which is I'm going to private donors asking for money, i.e. advertisers, doing that myself. I'm Terrell Starr, having my pitch and asking somebody for $1 million, right? I think that these ecosystems are, but I think with your question, I believe, I was talking to somebody at the University of Syracuse last week about this very thing. And I think the reason why I was able to have a read on Ukraine's ability to hold that a lot of people didn't was because I had the permission to express what I actually saw. And also, most people who go to Ukraine are not experts. They don't have any language skills. They don't understand the people. They haven't lived there. I've been going to Ukraine since 2008. There is no part of Ukraine that I have not been. So I didn't helicopter in. I knew the place. I knew the people. When someone would talk about language discrimination, I'm like, okay, that's bullshit. I know that because I lived there and I've spoken with people in Russian. I've done this, I've done that. And so I just simply have more knowledge than most people. And I knew more. But most people who are going there don't. And what was particularly about the people who were in Moscow, I have this, I don't know if it's a friction. Yeah, friction. I feel like I get along with Ukrainians better than a lot of the Westerners. A lot of Ukrainians, and I don't take this lightly, they literally say, you understand this better than those white Westerners. I mean, they tell me that, right? I mean, they all tell me that. And the reason being is that I'm used to people, I feel like the things that I reported resonate with people being tone police. Why are these Ukrainians angry? I think their country is going through an occupation, and their parents are in the Russian occupation. They have a right to feel angry and kind of fucked up, But I voiced that in my reporting. CNN, the ABC reporter, is not allowed to do that. But I have to do that because that's how I get audience. That's how I get people to tune in. People feel like they also know me. I was at a fish shop in Brooklyn. Some middle-aged Jamaican woman came up to me and was like, "Oh, I saw you on TV. You are in Ukraine. You're here and you're safe." This woman will never go to Ukraine. But she said, "Thank you, because I made you helped me to understand this more." That gives me hope, right? That gives me hope. This middle-aged Jamaican lady said, "You helped me to understand." I know it's because I look like her, and she felt like she could trust me. I was honest, And also she saw my reporting on Gaza, so she knows that I'm morally consistent. And she has faith in me. And that faith that she has in me is not the faith that she would have in somebody that reports from a multi-million-dollar corporation that's making hundreds of thousands of dollars that I wish that I could make. But I'm working on it. But yeah, I really am thankful that people have invested in my work and have invested in my voice, because and they included me as one source in their news gathering. My last note is, don't necessarily look at having to decide which type of journalism is or approach is better. Think about which people do I trust and respect. And, I got my reporter from this network, from this newspaper, then I have Terrell. So make me an addition to your news sources, and as opposed to just having to pick between one. And I think that's what the digital age is doing. I think that's a great thing.
Great. Well, we'll end on that happier note. So thank you so much to Terrell for a really invigorating talk and Q&A. And thank you to all of you for being here on this beautiful day. Thank you and good night.